The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Morgan and Morgan law offices, casting long shadows across the conference room. Elizabeth Liz Morgan, sharp in a tailored navy suit, stood with her arms crossed. Across the polished oak table sat her father, Charles Morgan, a towering figure in the legal world, with his signature steely expression betraying nothing. "You're making a mistake," Liz said, her voice steady but edged with restrained anger. "Andrew doesn't have the experience or the vision to lead this firm into the future." Charles leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Andrew may lack your pedigree, Elizabeth, but he's a Morgan. He understands the legacy. And I don't." Liz shot back, her tone incredulous. "Harvard, Yale Law Review, 2 landmark cases under my belt, and you think I don't understand what this firm means?" "It's not about understanding," Charles replied, his voice calm but dismissive. "It's about perception. Our clients, our long-standing, traditional clients, expect a certain image from this firm. Andrew fits that image." "An image," Liz repeated, biting down on the wave of frustration rising in her chest. "You mean a man. That's what this is about, isn't it?" Charles didn't deny it, which stung worse than if he had. Instead, he shifted in his chair and said, "You've done well here, Elizabeth. Better than anyone expected. But there are some things you can't change, no matter how talented you are." For a moment, Liz was speechless. She had prepared for a fight, but not for such blatant disregard of her value. "So all this time," she said finally, "you were just humoring me? Letting me believe I had a shot when you'd already decided Andrew was the heir." "I thought you'd understand," Charles said, his tone almost conciliatory. "There's always a place for you here, Elizabeth. A senior partner role, your own team, anything you want, just not this." Liz's hands clenched at her sides. "You think I spent all those years clawing my way to the top for a consolation prize? No, Dad. I wanted what I earned, what I deserved." She took a step back, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "You don't see me as an equal," she continued, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "You never did. And that's not just unfair, it's insulting." Charles stood, smoothing his tie. "Be careful, Elizabeth. You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. And you're letting your prejudice ruin this firm," Liz fired back, her resolve hardening. "You're so caught up in preserving the past, you're willing to gamble the future on someone unqualified." She grabbed her briefcase and turned toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, her back to her father. "You're wrong, Dad. About Andrew. About me. And one day, I'll prove it." As Liz walked out of the conference room, the weight of her father's betrayal settled heavily on her shoulders. But beneath the hurt, a fire had ignited. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Liz stood in the foyer of her parents' sprawling estate, the scent of freshly cut flowers wafting from an elaborate arrangement on the console table. She hadn't planned to come here, but after storming out of the firm, she needed answers. Answers that she thought, perhaps, her mother could give her. Margaret Morgan was seated in the sunlit parlor, a cup of tea cradled delicately in her hands. She looked up as Liz entered, her perfectly styled hair catching the light. "Elizabeth," she greeted warmly. "What a surprise." "I just came from the office," Liz began, her voice tight as she dropped her bag onto an armchair. "Dad handed the firm to Andrew." Margaret's smile faltered, and she set the teacup down. "I see. I see? That's all you have to say," Liz snapped. "He passed me over for Andrew, Mom. The guy who barely scraped through law school and couldn't even make it through his first trial without fumbling." Margaret sighed, her delicate features creasing with worry. "You know how your father is, dear. He believes in tradition. Andrew is the eldest son. It's expected." "Expected?" Liz paced the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Mom, this isn't the 19th century. I'm the most qualified person for the job, and Dad knows it. He just can't admit that I'm better than Andrew because I'm a woman." Margaret winced, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Elizabeth, please lower your voice. Your father. What about Dad?" Liz whirled around. Is he upstairs, waiting to tell me I'm being emotional again? Before Margaret could respond, Charles's voice cut through the air. Elizabeth, that's enough. He appeared in the doorway, his presence as commanding as ever, though his expression betrayed his simmering annoyance. This is a family matter, not a public spectacle. Liz crossed her arms, her chin lifting defiantly. You mean the kind of family matter where you treat me like I don't belong? Like all my work, my education, my sacrifices, none of it means anything because I'm not Andrew. Charles's jaw tightened. You're being dramatic. And you're being a coward, Liz shot back. You're so afraid of what the old boys club will think that you'd rather hand the firm to someone incompetent than to me. That's enough, Charles growled, his voice rising for the first time. This conversation is over. It's not over, Liz countered, stepping closer. You're not just hurting me, Dad. You're hurting the firm. And for what? Your pride? Your legacy? Newsflash, legacies don't last if they're built on lies. Elizabeth, please, Margaret interjected, her voice pleading as she stood between them. You know how your father is. He's set in his ways. Fighting him won't change anything. It will only tear this family apart. Liz turned to her mother, her heart sinking. So, what? I'm supposed to smile, nod, and let him walk all over me? Is that what you've done all these years? Margaret flinched as if struck. I just want to keep the peace. Well, peace isn't what I want, Liz said, her voice trembling. I want respect. I want what I've earned. Charles shook his head, his expression hardening. If you think you're going to force my hand with tantrums, Elizabeth, you're mistaken. Liz's gaze flicked between her parents, her father, resolute and unyielding, her mother, caught in the web of her own compromises. She realized, with a sharp pang, that she was utterly alone in this fight. Fine, Liz said, her voice cold. If you won't give me what I deserve, I'll find another way to get it. She grabbed her bag and strode to the door. Don't worry, she added, looking back at her mother. I won't tear this family apart. But I won't let you keep me in a corner either. The door slammed behind her, and Margaret sank into her chair, her hands trembling. Charles stood silent, staring at the doorway where his daughter had just been. Liz's suitcase sat open on her childhood bed, half filled with carefully folded clothes and files. The room was just as she'd left it when she moved out years ago, pale blue walls, bookshelves crammed with old legal textbooks, and a bulletin board still tacked with reminders of her college days. The familiar surroundings felt suffocating now, a reminder of everything she was walking away from. Margaret hovered in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. Elizabeth, please. This isn't necessary. Liz turned from the closet, clutching a tailored blazer. It is, Mom. I can't stay here and pretend like everything's fine when it's not. You're overreacting, Margaret said softly, stepping into the room. Your father, he's just trying to do what's best for the firm. No, he's doing what's best for his ego, Liz replied, tossing the blazer into her suitcase. And I'm not going to stand here and let him dismiss me like I'm nothing. Margaret's shoulders sagged. Where will you go? Liz hesitated, her hands pausing over the suitcase. The truth was, she didn't know exactly. All she knew was that she couldn't stay. I'll figure it out, she said, her voice steady. I've always figured it out. Margaret moved closer, her voice tinged with desperation. Elizabeth, think about what you're doing. Leaving like this, burning bridges with your father, it won't solve anything. Liz zipped the suitcase shut and straightened, fixing her mother with a determined gaze. I'm not burning bridges, Mom. I'm building my own. Why does it have to be one or the other? Margaret asked, her voice cracking. Why can't you stay and work within the system? Prove yourself. Make him see he's wrong. Liz laughed bitterly, shaking her head. Prove myself? Mom, I've done nothing but prove myself. Every award, every win, every late night at that firm. What more do I have to do? Wear a mask and pretend to be Andrew. Margaret flinched at the harshness in Liz's tone. He loves you, Elizabeth. He just doesn't know how to show it. Love without respect isn't enough, Liz said firmly, pulling the suitcase off the bed. I deserve better than scraps from his table. Margaret reached out, catching Liz's arm. If you leave, what happens to us? To this family? You'll be cutting yourself off. Liz softened slightly, her resolve tempered by the pain in her mother's eyes. I'm not cutting myself off, Mom. But I need space. I need to do this for me. Margaret let her hand fall away, watching as Liz wheeled the suitcase toward the door. And what happens if you fail? She asked quietly. Liz stopped in the doorway, her back to her mother. Then I'll fail knowing I fought for something that mattered, she said. But I won't fail, Mom. I can't. As she walked out of the house, the cool evening air hit Liz's face, sharp and bracing. She loaded her suitcase into the trunk of her car, glancing back at the sprawling estate that had once felt like home. Margaret stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the light from the house. Liz hesitated for a moment, her heart aching at the sight. But then she steeled herself, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it was entirely her own. The hum of office chatter buzzed around Liz as she sat in her new corner office, the skyline of the city stretching out before her. It had been 6 months since she left her family's firm, and the world she had built in that time felt both exhilarating and fragile, like walking a tightrope without a net. But she was thriving. After leaving her family behind, Liz had taken a leap of faith and applied to Carter and Reeves, one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. The interview process had been grueling, a gauntlet of case studies, strategy presentations, and high-pressure questioning. And yet, unlike with her father, she'd felt something different here: recognition. Validation. She'd earned the job as a senior litigator entirely on her own merit. Liz, came a voice from the doorway. It was Miranda Carter, one of the firm's founding partners, a woman whose sharp instincts had earned her a fearsome reputation in the legal world. Do you have a minute? Of course, Liz said, standing and gesturing to the chairs in front of her desk. Miranda waved her off and stepped inside, exuding the kind of presence Liz had always admired and strived to emulate. I just got off the phone with our client in the Vaughn case, Miranda began. They were singing your praises. Brilliant, tenacious, a force to be reckoned with. I believe those were their exact words. Liz felt her cheeks flush with pride. Thank you. It's been a challenging case, but... You made it look effortless, Miranda interrupted, a rare smile touching her lips. This is what I saw in you when we hired you, Elizabeth. You don't just understand the law, you understand people. That's not something you can teach. Liz met Miranda's gaze, the weight of her words settling over her. This was what she'd been searching for, a place where her efforts were seen and valued, where her work wasn't filtered through the lens of family politics or tradition. I appreciate that, Liz said earnestly. It means a lot to me. Miranda nodded, her smile fading into a more serious expression. I know what it's like to break away, to build something from nothing. It's not easy, but you're doing it. Keep going. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself. As Miranda left the office, Liz sank back into her chair, her mind swirling with thoughts. This wasn't just a job, it was a chance to redefine herself, to prove to herself that she didn't need the Morgan name to succeed. And yet, there were moments when the old doubts crept in, whispers of her father's disapproval and her mother's quiet despair. Shaking off the thought, Liz turned to her laptop and opened the Vaughn case files. She had a hearing to prepare for, and she wasn't going to let anything distract her. Not now. Not when she'd come so far. That evening, as she walked out of the office, Liz glanced at her phone and saw a missed call from Margaret. Her stomach twisted slightly. Her mother had been calling more frequently, leaving voicemails that alternated between supportive and pleading. Liz hadn't called back yet. She wasn't ready to hear her mother ask if she was coming home or, worse, if she could forgive Charles. Stepping into the brisk night air, Liz tilted her head up and let the cool breeze wash over her. She wasn't the same woman who had left her family's firm 6 months ago. She was stronger now, independent. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The courtroom was electric, the kind of tension that only came from high-stakes cases. Liz stood confidently at the podium, her voice clear and steady as she delivered her closing argument. The Vaughn case, a corporate whistleblower against a powerful conglomerate, had been grueling, but Liz had owned the courtroom from day one. "Justice isn't just about punishing the guilty," she said, her eyes sweeping over the jury. "It's about protecting those brave enough to speak out. It's about standing up to power and saying, we will not be silenced." As she returned to her seat, she caught a subtle nod from her boss, David Reed, sitting in the audience. David, a seasoned litigator with a sharp mind and a sharper wit, had taken her under his wing when she joined Carter and Reeves. He'd become more than just a mentor, he was an ally in her fight to carve out her place in the legal world. Later, back at the office, the Vaughn verdict was all anyone could talk about. The jury had ruled in their favor, a landmark win that would likely set new legal precedents. Liz had barely stepped out of the elevator when applause erupted from her colleagues. "Speech! Speech," someone called, and Liz couldn't help but laugh, holding up her hands. "Let's save the speeches for the celebration later," she said. "Right now, I need coffee and about 6 hours of sleep." David appeared at her side, his usual cool demeanor softened by a rare smile. "You crushed it, Liz. Vaughn himself called to thank us, and when I say us, I mean you." Liz felt a swell of pride. It was a team effort. "Don't be modest," David said. "You've built a reputation here, Elizabeth. People know you're not just good, you're exceptional. Keep it up, and you'll be running this place someday." His words caught her off guard, a mix of pride and bittersweetness washing over her. It was everything she'd ever wanted to hear, recognition for her abilities, unclouded by familial expectations or biases. And yet, it also reminded her of what she'd left behind. That evening, as the firm gathered at a rooftop bar to celebrate the victory, Liz found herself alone for a moment, looking out over the city. The skyline glittered, a testament to ambition and achievement. She thought of her father, his unwavering belief in tradition, and how she'd defied him to get here. "You're quiet," David said, appearing beside her with a drink in hand. Liz smiled faintly. "Just thinking. About how far I've come," she admitted. "And how much farther I want to go." David raised his glass. "To that, I'll drink. But don't forget to enjoy the view along the way." She clinked her glass against his, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And for the first time in her career, the path ahead felt like her own. But even as the celebration buzzed around her, Liz couldn't shake the thought of her family. The echoes of her father's voice, the wistful tone of her mother's calls, it all lingered, a reminder of a part of her life that still felt unresolved. The stack of files on Liz's desk seemed taller than usual that morning, but it was the thick red folder on top that caught her attention. She flipped it open, her heart skipping a beat at the first page, Morgan and Associates versus Vega Innovations. Liz's breath hitched. Morgan and Associates. Her family's firm. "Morning," David said, walking into her office without knocking, as was his habit. He dropped his coffee cup on the corner of her desk and leaned against the doorframe. "I see you've gotten the file." Liz nodded, still staring at the document. "Morgan and Associates. That's my family." "I know," David said, his tone even. "But you're the best person for this case. Vega Innovations is counting on us to defend them against Morgan and Associates' lawsuit. It's a big one, Liz. You can handle it." She looked up, her mind racing. "David, you know what this means. It's not just a case for me." "I do," he said. "And that's exactly why I want you on it. You know their playbook. You know how they think. If anyone can win this, it's you." Liz stood, pacing behind her desk. "But going up against them, against my father, Andrew, it's going to stir up a lot of things. Things I'm not sure I've put to rest." David stepped closer, his voice firm but supportive. "Liz, I'm not asking you to confront your past for the sake of drama. I'm asking because this case could define your career. If we win, Vega becomes one of our biggest clients, and you'll be the one who made it happen." Liz glanced at the file again, the weight of it heavy in her hands. "And if we lose?" David tilted his head. "You won't. But even if you did, you'd have faced them on your terms. you'd have stood up to them in a way they can't ignore. The logic was sound, but Liz couldn't ignore the knot tightening in her chest. Facing Morgan and Associates would mean facing her father's betrayal all over again. It would mean standing across from Andrew in a courtroom, the sibling rivalry amplified to a public spectacle. And it would mean proving, once and for all, that she was the better lawyer, not because she needed to, but because the truth demanded it. "Okay," Liz said finally, her voice steady. "I'll take the case." David nodded, a small smile of approval flickering across his face. "Good. I'll set up the first meeting with Vega tomorrow. In the meantime, take the day to review the file. This isn't just a legal battle, Liz, it's chess. And you're about to checkmate the Morgans." As the door closed behind David, Liz sank back into her chair, the weight of the decision settling over her. She opened the file and began reading, her mind oscillating between strategy and memory. She could see her father's disapproving glare, hear Andrew's smug laugh. The case was about intellectual property. Morgan and Associates was accusing Vega Innovations of infringing on a technology patent. It was high-stakes, complex, and fiercely competitive. In other words, exactly the kind of case Liz thrived on. She pushed her personal feelings aside and dove into the work, her pen flying across the legal briefs as she annotated, analyzed, and strategized. But as night fell and the office emptied, Liz found herself staring at the name on the opposing counsel's list: Charles Morgan, senior partner; Andrew Morgan, lead litigator. This wasn't just a case. It was a reckoning. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional rustle of paper or the click of a pen. Liz stood at the podium, her tone measured and incisive as she dismantled Morgan and Associates' argument piece by piece. Across the room, Andrew sat at his table, his expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief. His rebuttals had been weak, riddled with inconsistencies Liz had pounced on with precision. "This isn't just about legal precedent, Your Honor," Liz said, turning to the judge with a calm intensity. "It's about fairness, about upholding the principles that protect innovation. Morgan and Associates' claim is baseless and punitive, designed to stifle competition rather than seek justice. Vega Innovations deserves the court's protection." As she returned to her seat, David leaned in and whispered, "That was a masterpiece." Liz offered a tight smile, her adrenaline still surging. Across the room, her father's steely gaze bore into her. It was the first time in weeks she'd looked directly at him since the case began, and the cold indifference in his eyes was like a knife to her chest. The judge's ruling came swiftly. After reviewing the evidence and arguments presented, the court finds in favor of Vega Innovations. Morgan and Associates' claim is dismissed with prejudice. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Liz allowed herself a small exhale of relief, her hands gripping the edge of the table. David clapped her on the back, beaming. "You did it." But Liz's eyes drifted to her father and brother. Andrew's face was flushed, his jaw tight as he hastily packed up his papers. Charles stood behind him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Liz thought he might acknowledge her, even if just with a nod. Instead, he turned and strode out of the courtroom, Andrew trailing behind him without so much as a glance in her direction. The sting of their dismissal hit harder than Liz expected. She had just proven, definitively, that she was not only their equal but their better. And yet, they refused to see it, or worse, refused to admit it. "You coming?" David asked, breaking her reverie. Liz straightened, her resolve hardening. "Yeah. Let's go." As they walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed, microphones and cameras thrust toward Liz. "Ms. Morgan, how does it feel to defeat your family in court?" one shouted. Liz paused, meeting the reporter's gaze. This case was never about family. It was about justice. And today, justice was served. The reporters pressed for more, but Liz and David pushed through, climbing into the waiting car. As they drove back to the firm, David turned to her. "You okay?" Liz stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her. "I will be," she said. Winning this case, it was about more than just the verdict. It was about proving to myself that I could stand on my own. David nodded, his respect evident. And you did. That evening, as Liz sat in her apartment, the glow of the city lights filtering through her windows, she thought about the courtroom. About her father's cold indifference and Andrew's frustration. She had won, but their silence lingered like a shadow over her triumph. But this time, Liz didn't let it consume her. Their refusal to acknowledge her didn't diminish her achievement. She had fought for her clients, for herself, and she had won. They couldn't take that away from her. As she poured herself a glass of wine and opened the folder for her next case, Liz realized something. She wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. She was fighting for her future. The faint hum of the city filled Liz's apartment as she sat curled up on her couch, a legal brief balanced on her lap. Her glass of wine sat untouched on the coffee table, its deep red color catching the light from the flickering candles she'd lit to stave off the solitude. The silence felt heavier tonight, as if the weight of the past weeks had finally caught up with her. She set the brief aside, leaning her head back against the cushions. The courtroom victory should have felt triumphant, but instead, it left her hollow. Images of her father's impassive face and Andrew's tight-lipped anger replayed in her mind. She had spent so much of her life striving to earn their respect, only to find that even victory wasn't enough to bridge the chasm between them. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. Mom. Liz hesitated, the familiar ache of disappointment stirring in her chest. Her mother had called several times since the verdict, leaving voicemails filled with carefully measured words that tiptoed around the deeper issues. Taking a deep breath, Liz picked up the phone and pressed the call button. Elizabeth, Margaret answered almost immediately, her voice warm but tentative. I was hoping you'd call. I've been busy, Liz said, her tone neutral. What's going on? There was a pause, the kind of silence that stretched with unspoken words. I just wanted to check on you, Margaret said finally. I know the case must have been difficult. Liz's jaw tightened. Difficult doesn't even begin to cover it. I know your father, Margaret began, but Liz cut her off. Don't, Liz said, her voice sharper than she intended. Don't make excuses for him, Mom. He couldn't even look at me after the verdict, let alone say anything. And Andrew? He stormed out like a spoiled kid who lost a game. Elizabeth, Margaret said softly, your father, he has his ways. You know that. He's proud of you, even if he doesn't say it. Proud? Liz let out a bitter laugh. Proud of what? That I proved him wrong in front of a judge? That I showed Andrew isn't half the lawyer he thinks he is. Don't be cruel, Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. This isn't easy for him either. Easy for him? Liz's frustration bubbled over. Mom, do you even hear yourself? I've spent my whole life trying to measure up to his impossible standards, and the one time I actually surpass them, he acts like I don't exist. Margaret was quiet for a moment. He loves you, Elizabeth. But he doesn't respect me, Liz replied, her voice heavy with resignation. And that's what hurts the most. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Margaret spoke, her tone cautious. You're right. He should have acknowledged you. But he's stubborn. He always has been. Liz rubbed her temples, the familiar headache of these conversations creeping in. Mom, I don't want excuses. I don't know how much longer I can keep caring about what he thinks. Don't say that, Margaret pleaded. Family is complicated. But it's still family. Is it, though? Liz asked, her voice tinged with sadness. Because right now, it feels like I'm just a lawyer he lost a case to. Margaret didn't respond, and Liz felt a pang of guilt. She knew her mother was caught in the middle, a lifetime of mediating between her husband's rigidity and her children's struggles. But Liz couldn't shoulder the weight of that anymore. I have to go, Liz said, her tone softening. Tell Dad. Tell him I'm fine. Elizabeth, Margaret said, her voice small, don't give up on him. Or us. Liz hung up before the lump in her throat could turn into tears. She set the phone down and leaned forward, cradling her head in her hands. The victory, the accolades, the recognition, none of it had healed the fracture in her family. If anything, the gulf felt wider than ever. After a long moment, she straightened, wiping at her eyes. She'd fought too hard to let this break her. The Morgans might not see her for who she truly was, but she had built a life where others did. And maybe that would have to be enough. For now. The knock on Liz's apartment door came just as she was settling into her evening routine. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 8, too late for deliveries or casual drop-ins. She hesitated for a moment before walking to the door and peering through the peephole. Her heart skipped a beat. Charles Morgan stood there, his posture stiff, but his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. He held his hat in one hand, a gesture she'd only seen him make when he was deeply uncomfortable. For a moment, Liz debated pretending she wasn't home. But curiosity and a lingering hope she couldn't quite extinguish compelled her to open the door. "Dad," she said, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" "Elizabeth," he began, his tone formal as ever, though there was a softness to it she hadn't heard in years. "May I come in?" Liz hesitated, then stepped aside, waving him in. He glanced around the modest, but tastefully decorated apartment, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Morgan estate. She could see him taking it all in, likely noting every detail, as was his habit. "What brings you here?" she asked, crossing her arms as she leaned against the kitchen counter. Charles stood in the center of the living room, turning his hat in his hands. "I came to talk," he said simply. "About the case." "About us." Liz raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Us? That's a new one." He flinched slightly but pressed on. "I owe you an apology." The words hung in the air, startling in their rarity. Liz blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "An apology?" "Yes," Charles said, meeting her gaze. "I was wrong. About a lot of things." Liz crossed her arms tighter, her guard firmly in place. "Care to elaborate?" He exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "When you left, I told myself it was for the best. That you were too emotional, too driven by pride, to lead the firm. But after watching you in that courtroom, seeing the way you handled yourself, the way you fought for your client, I realized I was projecting my own fears onto you." Liz's heart clenched at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And what fears are those?" "That I wouldn't be able to protect the legacy," Charles admitted, his voice low. "That I couldn't let go of the old ways, the traditions that I thought defined our success. But I see now that the firm's future isn't in tradition, it's in strength, in vision. And you have both." Liz swallowed hard, her throat tight. "You didn't seem to think so 6 months ago." "I know," he said, his expression pained. "I've made mistakes, Elizabeth. I see that now. And I want to make things right." She studied him, her emotions warring between resentment and longing. "So, what? You came here to say you're proud of me and hope we can go back to how things were." Charles shook his head. "No, things can't go back to the way they were. And maybe that's a good thing." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "I want to offer you a position at Morgan and Associates. Not as Andrew's subordinate or as a consolation prize, but as a leader. As the partner you've always deserved to be." Liz stared at him, her mind reeling. She had dreamed of this moment for years, of her father acknowledging her worth, offering her a seat at the table. But now that it was here, it felt complicated. "What about Andrew?" she asked, her voice steady. Charles's jaw tightened. "Andrew is talented in his own way, but he doesn't have your discipline, your drive. He knows that. He's coming to terms with it." Liz arched an eyebrow. "So, what's the catch?" "There's no catch," Charles said firmly. "You've proven yourself, Elizabeth. Not just to me, but to the entire legal community. Morgan and Associates needs you. I need you." Liz's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to believe him, to take this olive branch and rebuild the bridges that had burned between them. But the scars of his dismissal still lingered, and trust wasn't something she could summon on command. "I need time," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. Charles nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "Take all the time you need. Just know that the door is open." As he turned to leave, Liz called after him. "Dad." He paused, looking back at her. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly, for saying all that. It means something. Charles gave her a small nod, a glimmer of the father she'd always hoped to see in his eyes. It should. You've earned it. The door clicked shut behind him, and Liz sank into the nearest chair, her mind swirling. His words had reopened wounds she thought had healed, but they also carried a promise of something new. Something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Liz sat on the bench overlooking the park, the cool evening air brushing against her face. The city skyline glowed in the distance, its lights flickering like a living entity, vibrant and full of possibilities. In her lap rested the offer letter from Morgan and Associates. The firm's familiar logo stared back at her, the weight of the decision it represented pressing down on her chest. The day after her father's visit, the letter had arrived by courier, formalizing his verbal offer. Senior partner. Full autonomy over cases. A role in reshaping the firm's direction. Everything she'd once dreamed of, but on terms she never thought she'd be able to demand. And yet, she couldn't shake the gnawing uncertainty. Her phone buzzed on the bench beside her. She glanced at the screen. David Reed. Liz picked up, cradling the phone to her ear. Hey, David. Hey yourself. I just saw the news. Morgan and Associates posted a statement about their restructuring. Sounds like they're really trying to shake things up. His tone was casual, but Liz could sense the underlying curiosity. Yeah, she said, exhaling. Dad came by. He wants me to come back. There was a pause. And what do you want? Liz laughed softly, the question too complex to answer in a single sentence. I'm still figuring that out. You know, whatever you decide, you've got a place here, David said, his voice warm. You've built something incredible at Carter and Reeves. We'd hate to lose you, but I get it if you feel like you have unfinished business there. Thanks, David, Liz said, her voice tinged with gratitude. That means a lot. After they hung up, Liz leaned back on the bench, her gaze drifting to the park below. Families laughed and played, couples strolled hand in hand, and a group of teens shared animated stories near the fountain. The scene was a reminder of the life she'd built here, one defined not by her family's legacy, but by her own choices. But what if going back didn't mean giving in? What if it meant reclaiming the firm and reshaping it in her image? What if she could turn it into something that valued skill and merit rather than outdated traditions? The thought was tempting, but it came with risks. Returning to Morgan and Associates meant re-entering a world that had rejected her, a world where she would have to constantly prove she belonged. Would her father's newfound support hold steady, or would it crumble under pressure? On the other hand, staying at Carter and Reeves offered security, independence, and the chance to continue blazing her own trail. She'd earned her reputation there, free of the Morgan name. Was it worth jeopardizing that to rebuild bridges she wasn't sure would last? The weight of the decision felt almost unbearable. Mind if I sit? Liz looked up to see her mother, Margaret, standing beside her. Liz nodded, and Margaret took a seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I figured I'd find you here, Margaret said, her voice soft. You used to come here to think when you were a teenager. Liz smirked faintly. Some things don't change. Margaret tilted her head, studying her daughter. You've come so far, Elizabeth. I hope you know how proud I am of you. Liz's throat tightened. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. They sat in silence for a moment, the night settling around them. Your father's offer, Margaret said finally. It's a good one. But that doesn't mean it's the right one. Liz glanced at her mother, surprised. Margaret continued, her gaze steady. You don't have to go back, Elizabeth. Not if it means compromising who you are. But if you do go back, make sure it's on your terms. Don't settle for anything less. Liz nodded, her mother's words echoing her own thoughts. I just don't know if I can trust him, Mom. What if this is just another way to control me? Margaret reached out, taking Liz's hand. Then don't give him the chance. You've shown him what you're capable of. He knows it now. Make sure the terms are clear, and if they aren't, walk away. You've already built a life without him. Liz looked down at the offer letter, her thoughts a whirlwind of possibilities. She had a choice to make, one that would shape her future. As she folded the letter and slipped it into her bag, Liz stood, her decision still unmade, but her resolve unshaken. "I'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to her mother. Margaret rose, smiling gently. "I know you will." The two of them walked through the park, the city lights twinkling above them. Liz's path remained uncertain, but for the first time, she felt at peace with the uncertainty. Her next step, whether it led back to Morgan and Associates or forward with Carter and Reeves, would be hers to decide. The future stretched before her, unwritten and full of possibility. What would you do in Liz's position? Stay with the firm that gave her independence, or return to her family to rebuild a fractured legacy?